I am Anne Arundel County Executive Stuart Pittman, and you are listening to the Conduit Street Podcast, where the rubber meets the road of county public policy. Your drivers are Kevin Kinnally and Michael Sanderson, and they will take you where you need to be.
Hello and welcome to the Conduit Street Podcast. Kevin Kinnally here with Michael Sanderson. Michael, it's Wednesday. It's the beginning of June. We're getting ready for the summer conference. There's a lot going on. How you doing? How you holding up?
All good here. Springtime's upon us. Last week we talked about county budgets a little bit, and that feels like an annual right this time of year. And we were inspired to bring a couple guests on to dig a little deeper, and then we got a little wrinkle in the news, which I think makes this an even more on-point conversation. So I'm excited.
Absolutely. So we're going to cover the significance of bond ratings today. That's what Michael was referring to when he talked about a news item. We'll also talk about, when it comes to county budgets and the state budget, balancing the blueprint with everything else, right? The extinguishment of federal relief and how that impacts ongoing programs, budgeting to build and maintain infrastructure, and more and more and more and more. We had to trim down the list so we could make this palatable for our listeners. And we have two of the best in the business, like Michael said, to help walk us through all of it. Carroll County's Director of Budget and Management and the President of MACo's Budget and Finance Officers Affiliate, Ted Zaleski, and Harford County Treasurer, Robbie Sandlass. Gentlemen, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Great to be here.
Well, gentlemen, I'll jump right into this a little bit because we wanted to talk with you two sort of about the big picture of building county budgets, but public budgeting is sort of an at every level enterprise. And even while the state legislature passes its budget plan a little earlier in the year, we got news this week that I think makes talking about the state's fiscal situation a little more germane than it might have been even a week ago. And that is, I'll set the tone a little bit, and I want to chat about it. We know that public entities that eventually want to borrow money, generally speaking, go through a process of getting a bond rating. We did an episode 2 or 3 years ago. We had Jennifer Dirksen from Davenport Financial on. She had previously been an analyst with one of the investor services, and she kind of walked us through the process of bond ratings, what they mean, what they exemplify. But nominally, it's like creditworthiness for entities who may want to borrow. It's like your personal credit score. When you go get a mortgage or borrow money for a car, you get a better rate if you have a good credit score. Governments work the same way, and you go to places like Standard & Poor's and Moody's, and they stamp a letter grade that says you're either fairly highly creditworthy or less so, and you generally pay that in a corresponding rate in the marketplace. So what happened this last week, I guess, is a little bit tricky, but our loyal followers can handle getting in the weeds a little bit. Maryland has been a AAA state for a long time. By all the multiple agencies have always said we're at very good credit risk. We're at the top tier. But this year, Moody's, one of the three big hitters, indicated that Maryland is on a negative outlook. Basically, we still gave you a AAA, but the kinds of questions we're asking about a state like Maryland are basically, should we be pointing in a different direction, and should they be a candidate for a downgrade? So that's kind of news in Maryland. We haven't had to talk about the AAA bond rating. It's kind of been a given for some time. Can the two of you shed a little bit light? You've been through this process. You've worked with those agencies before. Can you tell us a little bit about what bond ratings mean to people in public finance generally?
Sure. So I'll start off. It is very much like your personal credit score. So the biggest and most obvious way that you see the benefits of having the AAA rating is that you get relatively speaking, a lower rate than what a AA would or what a single A would. Now, I will say that probably the difference between a AA rate and a single and a AAA rate, isn't super vast. It's probably about like 40 basis points and all. But when you're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars of bond sales, that can quickly add up to real money. One of the things, though, I think that where it kind of goes beyond just, how much do you save on an individual bond issuance, is that oftentimes it kind of relays to the business community, to the citizens, to the investment world, that this is a serious government. This is a government that has proper procedures in place, that budgets accordingly, that has proper reserves, and is all in all a relatively responsible organization that perhaps is like a great place to live or a great place to open up a business or something like that.
Yeah, and I think that investor confidence, Robbie, if you're just going through and you're looking at where to invest, you see these AAA bond ratings and right off the bat, these are the top, the big three agencies. If you're seeing AAA across the board, probably a safe bet. And Ted, when you think about public perception and just the ability for investors to take a look and know that Maryland is safe, like we said, it's probably not a huge deal at the end of the day in terms of its effect on everyday Marylanders, but certainly there are effects if you get a downgrade, and most of that would come toward, you're paying much more to borrow money, and that makes your budget problems perhaps a little bit more difficult. Is that your read on that too?
Yeah, it's how much you're going to sell, what rate you're going to sell at. I mean, there's a lot more variables than just your rating. When do you happen to go out? What's happening at the market that time? How many jurisdictions are selling at the same time? So it could be really hard to pull apart. Well, at a AAA, we sold for X, and at a AA, we sold for Y. And, in Carroll County, before we had our AAA, which took way too long, in my view of the world, we often sold at rates that looked a whole lot like what AAA counties were selling at. So if Maryland were downgraded or Carroll County was downgraded, I think I would be a lot more concerned about the perception part of it than I would about the exactly what is this going to mean in dollars. And, when you talk about kind of the people looking at you as something special, for counties with 3 AAAs, it's something like 2% of the counties in the United States. It's really pretty rare. Maryland is very unusual. We have 9 or 10 of them. I doubt that there's any place else in the country like this.
Right. I think Maryland is deeper with AAA jurisdictions than any state in the country. We've taken a soft look at that in the past, and I think that's the case. It may be partially a function of having relatively large county governments as opposed to lots and lots of smaller units, but also, generally speaking, we have a relatively strong local economy, and we have a history of relatively sound fiscal decision making, and so that's the sort of stuff that the bond houses are happy with. Like, a lot of counties have things like citizen spending affordability committees or other sort of watchdog groups that work hand in hand with the local governing bodies to give them guidance and set up multi-year budgeting like you do in Carroll County. There's a lot of best practices that lead to, okay, you get the stamp of approval from folks on high. They're trying to point to people like Chicago and say, you all ought to be doing things more like they are in Maryland. That's a pretty common circumstance. But I agree with the overall takeaway that a lot of this is kind of pageantry. I don't mean it in a disparaging way, but it's sort of like, I don't know, your AAA bond rating is a little bit like, oh, you graduated like Phi Beta Kappa. My grandparents were super excited that I was Phi Beta Kappa. I didn't think of it as all that big of a deal, and as a practical matter, it really never was. But they understood that because, I don't know, it's a language people can understand. So top grades on your bonds is kind of a, you made the dean's list or something like that. It feels that way, and politically, that stuff matters.
No politician, no elected official wants to be the person who lost the AAA bond rating.
Right,
so that's certainly the case.
It's a flex, and I think we take pride as counties in Maryland, and the state takes pride as well. I want to get into a little bit of what they're looking for, Ted and Robbie, and since you go through the process every year, a lot of this is you have to go up to New York, right? I know that Maryland, for the first time in a while, I think just invited down a couple of the agencies to come to Maryland in person to show off what we're doing in this state. But typically this involves going up to New York, right, and making your case to the agencies. So what are the kind of things that they're looking for? Because I know, like, for instance, I mean, Maryland does have a very strong economy. I know there are a lot of people that from the outside looking in can say, wow, that state relies a lot on its income tax, and that could be a problem. But then you look at the fact that we're buoyed by the federal government. That's right here, right? And that helps to offset that. So taking that example, what kind of things are they looking for when they're looking into counties, Robbie and Ted? And what's that trip like up to New York? What are the kind of things they're asking about? And what are you trying to highlight when you get there?
Yeah, well, generally it's a very compressed kind of a time frame. Most of us will do it in about a day and a half. So you kind of we'll have 2 meetings one day and then 1 meeting the next day, and then get on the train or the bus and head back home. Primarily the financials, including budget, and then also economic development. So really what they want to know is what type of revenues are you bringing in now, and kind of what's your revenue expectation or your tax base, and that's kind of where the economic development drives in. And there's other questions that they'll look into as well, as far as just overall administration, maybe land use, any type of outstanding litigation. But those 2 areas are really what drives it. And one of the things that's really changed, I think, over the past few years is it used to be a lot more opaque. It was kind of like, well, what goes into a AAA? I don't know. Now the rating agencies, I think, are becoming a lot more transparent, and they're all creating these scorecards. So now you're able to say, okay, this is really what we should be aiming for. Now, again, it's more of an art than a science. It's just like with your own personal score. You're not necessarily going to get an 800 if you do this and this, but you're much more likely to get a AAA if you have these certain things in place. And one of the areas where they're certainly looking, and we'll talk about this later on in the cast, is fund balances. So like that's a place where a lot of us have struggled. Well, what type of fund balances should we have? And now we're starting to get word from the scorecards that you should really be looking for a fund balance of about 20% of budget. That's where you should be. Now, again, if you're 19, does that mean you lose it? No, but those types of metrics. And they're also looking for other things too, as far as your assessable base, cash flows, your budget flexibility is a real big thing. Do you have the ability to raise revenues if you need to? Do you have the ability to make cuts in expenditures if you need to? And they kind of take all of this in after they listen to your presentation, and after they they review your financials and all the other materials that you have, and then they more or less make a recommendation. Those analysts make a recommendation, and then they take it to their committee. And then they more or less are then kind of fighting for their recommendation. Hey, this is why I think Harford should stay at AAA. And they go back and forth, and sometimes they'll come back and they'll ask us questions like, hey, can you send us this or send us that? And then it's normally a very quick turnaround though. I mean, you go up. So for Harford County, generally going up in January, 2 to 3 weeks later, we get the rating. And then a week or so later, we're selling the bonds. And then, a week or so later, closing on the bonds. So it all takes place in about like a 6-week span. Now, of course, the preparation of that, though, is much longer. We start to prepare for ours in September for a presentation we give in January.
At a high level, talk about what are we trying to do with them? I think a lot of it comes down to showing them that you have flexibility and showing them that you're willing to make the decisions that need to get made. They don't always care that much about exactly what you're doing or even exactly what your situation is. If they're comfortable that if something changes, that you can and will deal with it. Like from a rating agency perspective, having the capacity to raise taxes is a big plus. They're not arguing for you to raise taxes, and your elected officials might not be interested in raising taxes. But if you can say we can, that's important. Mm-hmm. And sometimes we're trying to shape the message in ways that might not be obvious to people. I remember one year we went up, and it was during a time when our school enrollment was falling, and we had arguably more capacity than we needed. And to the rating agencies, I showed them a map of where we had more capacity than necessary and the very few places where it was a problem. My message being building schools isn't a concern for us, which was important to them. But I remember a commissioner talking to me after the meeting. He said, oh, wow, you took that capacity thing and made it sound like it was a good thing. And for that use, it was.
So you really are selling your county, and you're selling your fiscal responsibility, your ability to change pace if you need to raise revenue, to kind of turn on a dime, right? And that's super important, I guess, from a rating agency perspective. And I think part of what's going on here, the rating agencies, when they look at the state, is particularly Moody's. Again, they still have a AAA rating, but they're looking at some of the structural deficit, right? In the out years, they're looking at the commitments that the state has made. They maybe look at the legislature. The legislature decided not to go for a broad across the board tax increase, which maybe would have assuaged some concerns when you look at the top line numbers and where the state's going to be. So that has to be a concern for them, right? If they're looking at your commitments and then your ability, not only your ability to raise revenue, but how much revenue you can raise and where the gap's going to lie. So is that something that comes up quite frequently with these bond rating agencies too?
Yeah, I can say personally, we have a whole slide where we compare our rates against other rates, and we talk about income tax. Income tax is capped at 3.2. At Harford, we're 3.06. So, we're able to say, hey, we could go up to 3.2 if we needed to. We're not up against that cap. And if we would, for Harford, it's $14-15 million. And hey, this is how much we would do for a penny. And you can see how we compare against other jurisdictions. So again, there's a lot of places where they have tax caps or things like that. And that's definitely one of those areas that the rating agencies will sometimes, even if everything else is strong, they'll hold that against you. So if you don't have that, it's again, as Ted said, a big plus.
When you think about what credit ratings are all about, they've gotten very, very complicated, tons of information involved. But really, the only purpose for doing it is for somebody other than the government who's issuing the debt to say to somebody who wants to buy the debt, you should feel comfortable that you're going to get paid.
Right.
So what they really need to do, the agencies, is be comfortable that you're not going to make them look bad. So when you talk about the structural deficit, I don't think it's the rating agency's most pressing concern. I think they're much more worried about, can you balance a budget that's going to include paying all your debt? Now, it's not to say that a long-term plan has no importance. Clearly, it does. But we all are required by law to balance one budget. We don't have to budget. We don't have to balance 3 or 5 or 6 years. We only have to balance one. And going back to the making them confident, the rating agencies confident, is even if you have a structural deficit built into your plan, do they believe that when you have to balance the next budget that you're going to be able to do it?
Right. So I think as we think about the state of Maryland right now, at various times on this podcast, we've talked about the multi-year fiscal forecast looks a little shaky, particularly when some fund balance sitting in the education trust fund that the state has set up is expired, and the state starts to bear the cost of its own blueprint plan in the general fund. So that's what you're looking at when you're looking at a multi-year forecast. Like, this year worked out okay, but then 26 is a little shakier, and then 27 gets challenging, and the years beyond, because the incremental costs of this education commitment are becoming borne sort of year by year in the general fund rather than coming out of the piggy bank. So like, if you're at Moody's and you're looking at that saying, we want to see what Maryland's plan is, you're kind of asking those questions. Do they have the wherewithal, both the economy to raise the revenues or the political will to raise the revenues, or are they willing to adjust their spending plan to rein it in to make that multi-year fiscal forecast look reasonable? And they're kind of indifferent, or they're agnostic on whether you do A or B. We just want to see that you have a plan and a mechanism to get there. One thing I know Maryland does that most people don't understand, that the bond rating agencies tend to like, is we actually pay debt service on bonds through a special fund that's paid for by the state property tax. So the annuity bond fund is one of those little Harvard special funds, kind of off the books for people who talk about the general fund. But the state property tax rate is set by the Board of Public Works, not the General Assembly. It's a 3-member body. That's the governor, the treasurer, and the comptroller. That's who votes each year on what the state property tax rate is. So we have a relatively nimble way to make sure bondholders are paid off in each fiscal year, that even if you had loggerheads in your state legislature, there's a 3-member body who can come and sweep up the mess. If you're Moody's, that should be a reassurance, I would think.
Yeah, I agree. That's really, really big. For the rating agencies to be able to look and say, the money you need to pay your debt is not in competition with the money you need for education or public safety. That's huge.
Yeah, and that you can do that without going through a big, back and forth with the General Assembly. If that were the case, you can do it relatively easily. You'd think that also is a good indicator from where Moody's sits. But gentlemen, I think that's a good conversation on this bond rating discussion. Big headlines, of course, there's a lot of pride, but the everyday Marylander is not going to feel the effects of the outlook being downgraded from Maryland to negative from Moody's. Again, the state still maintains its 3 AAA bond ratings and is very proud of that. We're going to go ahead and take a break. When we come back, we'll get into the blueprint. We'll talk to Robbie and Ted about some on-the-ground perspective of how they're making the blueprint work against everything else. We'll also get into federal money drying up and why it's really important when we talk about one-time expenditures versus ongoing expenditures. We'll talk a lot about that. And then we'll get into building and maintaining infrastructure, the local perspective there, all that and more after the break.
When you choose Care First Blue Cross Blue Shield for your team, you get exactly what's in our name. Care First. We're transforming healthcare to make care more affordable and more accessible for you, your business, and your employees. With the support of a team dedicated to the health of your people and access to a network of over 1 million providers, we've got your back and theirs with care. Learn more at carefirstforbusiness.com.
Welcome back to the Conduit Street Podcast. Kevin Kinnally back here with Michael Sanderson, Ted Zaleski, and Robbie Sandlass. On the first half, we talked about bond ratings, the significance of bond ratings. We're going to stay in the budget world with our guests. Again, Ted and Robbie. I want to get into the blueprint. And we have talked, I think, more about the blueprint on this podcast probably than anything else from the beginning. So our listeners, I think, are very familiar. We are now into the implementation stage, and there is a lot of chatter across the state just about this being very tough on not only the state budget, but now on local budgets too. And as this phase-in gets more and more, we're starting to feel it more and more and more. So I want to talk about the blueprint. It aims to do a lot of great things for our kids and for our schools. But again, we know it's super expensive. It is budget season, and you've been right in the thick of it. So what's it like trying to make all of this work, trying to budget for the blueprint, which we know is super expensive, without cutting other important programs, without feeling the pressure to raise revenue elsewhere, and with limited ability to raise revenues, by the way, to make everything work? How has that played out? What are you seeing out there? I'll start with you, Robbie.
So I think the counties in Maryland are split into almost 2 camps. There were some that had a really heavy lift that they needed to make in order to meet the statutory formulas, all part of Blueprint. And then there was the other half of the counties that when the state came in and said, actually, you're doing okay as far as your mandated obligation. But what a lot of those counties, and I think Ted and my county are both into that camp, where we didn't necessarily have a huge gap to make up from a statutory standpoint, is that we're now running into lots of things that are getting pushed out as the school system tries to comply with all of the mandates of Kerwin. And we've talked about a lot of them, the $60,000 starting salary, the 60-40 split in the classroom, the pre-K. But, again, I think what you're also seeing is that there's a lot that really wasn't in Kerwin that Kerwin didn't, or Blueprint didn't necessarily speak to, things like class sizes, things like extracurriculars. And that's where you're seeing a lot of pressure now, particularly in some of those schools that might not have all of the poverty metrics and the like, your more upper middle class schools, where from the Blueprint perspective, they may have excess funding, but from a on the ground perspective, those parents are not going to say, oh, I'm okay with losing, with being in a class of 50 kids, or not having band or JV sports or things like that. And that's where it's really becoming real, because up until this point, it's been somewhat theoretical. It all sounds good when you would ask them, what's going to be cut from the various state commissions. They really couldn't quantify it, and they would just say, well, that's a local decision. But at the same time, they would say, Kerwin and the Blueprint is ultimately about, kind of reimagining things. It's not just plus what you were doing. You might need to stop doing some of the things you were doing. But that's not going to be an easy sell, and that's going to be really hard, I think, for a lot of people. And that's now what the counties are dealing with. Is we have all of these funding requests that aren't necessarily tied to that mandated spending, but there's a lot of pressure to meet them.
And Ted, from the school board perspective, if you're in their shoes, I mean, they are dealing with a similar situation with the state and the counties where a lot of federal money flowed in during the pandemic, right? And they used that money to stand up some really important programs that people like, programs that have worked really well. And then the spigot turns off, that money goes away. And when you try and cut something that people really like, you're going to hear about it from parents, right? And we know that. So the school board, I mean, and then they're looking at the blueprint, which is very prescriptive in terms of where that money needs to go. And I think, just a year ago, talking about, we might have to cut band, or we might have to cut, this program or that program, that was all theoretical, like Robbie said. But now those things, we're hearing about those things in every county. We're hearing school boards say, look, if we don't give us this much, and we know it's above what you have to give us, and we're not, this is what it is, we'll have to cut all these things because we don't have any flexibility on where we need to spend the money. So that stuff is playing out right now. And I think that's part of the big difference. Ted, what are you seeing in terms of, how school boards are reacting and sort of the impact of that federal money going away?
Big influx of money like that is always a good thing, but it's also always a dangerous thing because it can lead you to do things that fiscally you probably shouldn't do. And like Robbie said a little bit earlier, I forget exactly what he was talking about, but when there's money on the table, it's hard to tell people we shouldn't be making use of it. Now, I will say in Carroll, I think our school system did go about using the federal money the right way. I think they didn't build a lot of ongoing programs that we're now trying to figure out how to fund, but I'm sure there are places where that is a big concern. And, it concerns, I'm sometimes called Mr. Doom and Gloom because I'm always talking about the things we need to worry about. I think blueprint is for counties and school systems the big worry. At the start of this budget process with our commissioners, I said, blueprint isn't the elephant in the room, it's the herd of elephants in the room. This is so big, it's hard to even really grasp what this is going to mean to us from the school perspective or the county perspective. And, right now, you talked about multi-year plans earlier. We don't have the full impact of blueprint built into our plans because we don't know what the full impact of blueprint is. We don't have any way to quantify this right now. So it's going to be a problem. And, for schools, I wouldn't want to be a superintendent right now dealing with this because there's not going to be any easy path for them. Robbie was talking about some of the pressures, and I think this is going to be very, very real. The things that they might have to offer up to make themselves compliant with the state law are not going to be popular with anybody. And the pressure on the counties really becomes about those things. I think the things nobody's going to want to give up because the state funding is not enough for school systems to meet the law. And counties, even where we haven't been legally asked to do it yet, the expectation is we're the ones who are going to fill that gap. And, going back to some of the other things we were talking about, few, if any of us are in position to fill that gap and keep those negative things from happening, keep class sizes going up in certain schools, to make certain activities remain funded instead of going away to make the rest of the law work.
I think that the dynamic of county governments having the ultimate say in funding levels for public schools at the countywide system process. That's the Maryland structure. It's a little bit unusual. There's lots of states who do things different ways. Lots of places have a special property tax rate that's specifically for schools and levied by the school system or subject to referendum or whatever. There's lots of different models. Maryland's model is the school board presents its proposed budget. They present it to the county government, and then the county government has to weigh that against the other needs across county government, the functions of park and rec and public safety and infrastructure and all the different things the county needs to do up against tax rates and so forth, and tries to make that overall balance work. You end up with this tension that is not a result of bad actors. It's just everybody playing their role. If you're a member of a school board, your role here is basically be an advocate for we need all the things for the kids and for the teachers and for the outcomes that we want. So we end up with circumstances where a given county might be doing more than they have to, more than the state's calculated share of the local component for all these blueprint programs. even more than they're required, more than their maintenance or whatever. And the schools will still be able to say, but this is a cut of this many millions of dollars from what we asked for. And therefore, that's why we're going to have to cut band, or that's why we won't be able to do the gifted and talented program this year. It's because the county didn't come up with the money for everything we wanted. And that is happening. That is happening in county seats this year. It feels like it's accelerated and sort of underscored by the tensions around the blueprint and the requirement that school systems spend more and more state money in alignment with the state functions. But that's a tension that is out there, even in places where the political leadership have been very pro blueprint and pro spending on education.
When you say tension, I think that hits exactly on target. It's built into the Maryland model. School systems have the authority to run school systems, but they have no control over their revenue. Counties have a legal obligation to fund schools, but have almost no authority to run the school systems. Even with the best of people and the best of intentions, there's no getting around. That's a hard way to work sometimes.
And a lot of it too is that the counties have oftentimes a little bit more discretion on what we can do with our school funding. Again, there's floors, there's maintenance of effort, there's things like that. With the state system of funding schools, it's largely formulaic. Okay, this is our number. So we know that this year was, relatively speaking, not a huge growth year for state funding of direct funding to the schools. Some of those higher funding ones are in the out year. But at the local level, I think there's just this expectation that, the county has the money, they can spend it, which is why you'll see, our public hearings are filled with people, making those requests as opposed to, making them directly to the state, where again, it's much more formulaic.
Right.
What Robbie just said is a very big practical problem for us in counties, because state funding is more or less determined. It's not negotiated. If the school system needs more money, the only direction they can go is to their county elected officials. So to the public, it ends up appearing as if what the school system can or can't do is dependent on what the county is willing or not willing to do.
Right. And, people see that process play out locally, right? They see the hearings, they watch people go up and ask for these things. They say, if you don't give us this money, we're going to have to cut all these things. And if I'm an elected official and I'm in my neighborhood and I'm driving home and I have people coming up to me saying, oh my gosh, they're going to cut Johnny's football. And then across the street, Sarah's band is going to get cut. I'm coming to you, Ted, and I'm coming to you, Robbie, and I'm saying, hey, we need to find the money to do this. And that's also a tension, right, between electeds and folks like you who are trying to keep the train on the tracks and explain why it's important to keep fund balances and why we can't spend this money. And that leads us into the next bit here is we know that the blueprint is massive. We know that you're trying to fund all these other things that are also very important to a lot of other people. But if I'm an elected official and I come to you, Robbie, and I say, hey, I see this money sitting right here. We can spend it. My phone will stop ringing. I can go to my neighborhood cookout again. No one's going to yell at me. Why don't you just spend the money, make it go away? You, Robbie, are saying, well, this money is federal money, and this is something that we don't want to create an ongoing expenditure. That creates tension. And Robbie and Ted, I want to get into one-time versus ongoing and how important that's been. And now we are starting to see it play out in terms of why it was so important. And those decisions could come back to haunt you if you didn't do it the right way.
Yeah, and I think you're seeing every jurisdiction across the state, and including the state, kind of dipping into their fund balances and using a significant portion of them for ongoing. And it doesn't matter, again, the type of jurisdiction, rural, urban, red or blue. They're all kind of in this mode right now, and I think it's happening for a couple of reasons. One, like our fund balances grew significantly kind of during the COVID years. Kind of a combination of some federal money coming in, which could free up other money, some expenditures not happening, and then also, oddly enough, like our revenues really went up considerably at all levels, state and local during the pandemic, particularly income tax, but also recordation, transfer tax, things like that. So now we're in a situation that the revenue growth has somewhat slowed. It's not negative or anything, but it's slowing, but the cost pressures are becoming very high. And when you have that situation and you're like, well, we can make some of this, we can ameliorate some of this problem by dipping into fund balance. And again, whether that's just extra unassigned fund balance, or for those other jurisdictions that maybe have tapped into that and are now looking at maybe their rainy day funds, I think the concern is that we create an environment that if there really is a recession, if there is a significant, natural disaster or something like that, and you need to come up with funds and you've exhausted some of those outlets, now you have to make mid-year cuts. And that's one of the things with counties that by the time we sometimes figure out that the revenues aren't going to be there, and if we've overextended ourselves on the expenditure side, we can't cut the schools mid-year. You can't generally cut the community college. You're not going to cut debt service. So you end up with a really small portion of the budget that you can sometimes affect changes. And oftentimes it might not be until, February or March. So you're trying, you've already spent half the year's budget, and now you're trying to make sure that you have enough, enough budget to go around, and you're trying to make these cuts. And that's really been one of the challenges. And I think that's the real world challenge. And then, in addition to that, you certainly have the bond rating agencies that are then concerned if you're drawing down your resources. And you're making decisions tougher in the future. So it's a little bit of, do you make some of these adjustments now so that in the future you can, be on a better glide path? Or do you kind of view it as, okay, this is a rocky patch and maybe we're going to use the fund balance to kind of get ourselves over this. I think you kind of have to look at the circumstances, but when I look at what's happening now and the way costs are kind of escalating and revenues, though, are tracking less than, it doesn't seem as if it's like a 1-year blip kind of a thing. I think we need to kind of readjust and say, okay, hey, where do we really think revenues are going from here, and where do we think the expenditures are going? And I think almost all the jurisdictions have that mismatch right now.
Yeah, the easiest way to think about this one-time question is you should never use one-time money to fund an ongoing expenditure unless you are very, very confident that you have a revenue increase coming that is going to be enough to take care of it. Otherwise, you've created a problem for yourself. But go back to something that Kevin said. The really hard thing is for your elected officials, they aren't being yelled at about 3 years from now. They're being yelled at about what's going on right now. And it's a lot easier for me to say, no, you shouldn't be using that money. We're going to create a problem for ourselves down the road, than it is for them to say, yeah, Ted, you're right. We don't want to create a problem down the road. So let's change what we're doing now. It could be very, very compelling for an elected official to act today on something that they can do today and say, okay, well, yeah, we know that'll create a problem, but we'll figure that out.
And that's really the art of being, an effective elected official, is listening to all the different voices that's in your cabinet, among your advisors. And finance officers are inherently conservative, and I mean that in the sense of not wanting to avoid risk and wanting to have proper reserves and all of that. But again, you're going to have other voices. The school system, we're talking about the importance of educating the children, or public safety with all of that, and you then have to take all of those voices and try to blend them. And where at the end of the day, finance is just a part of it. Finance is kind of what drives a lot of this stuff, but it's just one of the voices in the room.
And to connect a couple of dots, and even just in today's conversation, one more voice in the room is your bond rating analyst saying, well, we think that your jurisdiction ought to have 20% of an annual budget lying around in a SOC and reserves, independent of one-time federal money or whatever. So we think you should just have an account sitting around with that many millions of dollars. And whether it's a resident who is arguing for the new park, or whether it's the labor union arguing on behalf of your current employees and recruiting and retention, it's really tough as a fiscal steward to say, I'm making it a priority to keep this money in reserve and not spend it today, whether it's that today versus tomorrow dynamic, or we need to demonstrate fiscal responsibility in order to remain competitive in the bond market and with our bond rating. I mean, all those are pulling in opposite direction. The today versus Sunday is a perpetual. Like, every elected official is asked to pass the marshmallow test all the time with every budget and every fiscal decision, now or later.
Right. And I guess, again, if you call it reserves and you have rainy day funds and whatnot, I mean, devil's advocate, I could say, well, it's raining, right? We should use the money. But I guess, Robbie and Ted, what you're saying is, If you're a meteorologist, your outlook is it's going to rain a lot over the next few years, and this becomes unsustainable. So if we're going to dip into fund balances and that's going to be the norm, not only is that going to affect our credit ratings, it's going to affect, the bottom line moving forward. And these decisions today, I mean, there's got to be a lot of pressure, right? These decisions today are going to affect the future, and we cannot keep dipping into fund balances. That is not something that's sustainable. So while someone could make the argument, hey, it's raining, again, you could say, well, it's not going to look any better, so we can't be doing that. I mean, the pressure's got to be real, but you've gone through your budgets, and a lot of talk about schools, public safety. Those seem to be the two big items this year for county budgets. It's education and public safety. Does that line up for Carroll and Harford County as well?
Yeah, it's always going to be true.
Right.
They never leave the top priority.
Right.
And how many budgets do you see? Pick a year, and how many budgets you go to the budget message, and this budget prioritizes education and public safety.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at most of your budgets, schools are about 50%. Debt service is 10%. Then of that remaining 40%, generally about 20% or so is public safety, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, and then everything else is oftentimes 15%. So it's, again, it kind of doesn't matter the county. We all kind of end up tracking similar there.
And when it comes to the other side of that, well, just raise revenue, right? I think both of you are in the position where you have room on the income tax. About half of Maryland counties are maxed out when it comes to the income tax. The only other way to raise revenue, and really the only way to raise revenue, is through the property tax, right? And if you have room on income tax, that's real money too. But the property tax is really the only place to go. I mean, does that tie your hands in some ways, right? Everybody hates the property tax. Michael and I have talked about that a lot. It's regressive. You have to cut a check. Everybody hates it. But really, that's the only place you have to go. And that's also got to be frustrating at some point to say, you're telling us we have to do all these things, but then the only way we can raise the revenue is very regressive. And it's the one way that people hate the most.
Yeah. And, if you look at almost all counties, property tax and income tax combined are generally, 80, 85, maybe as high as 90% of your ongoing revenue. So all the other things are kind of, they're essential, your fees and the 911, what have you, recordation transfer tax, but it's really driven by those two sources. One of the things I think that's sometimes so helpful in order to explain things to individuals is that for all of us, we generally know how much money we make per penny on a property tax. So in Harford County, it's around $4 million. So from something like that, if our school system is saying, we would like $40 million of additional funding and above and beyond what normal revenues are going to provide. From there we can say, okay, well, if we were to raise the property tax in order to offset that expenditure, in order to pay for that expenditure, that's a 10-cent property tax increase. So, Harford County would go from a 98 cents property tax rate to $1.08. And then you kind of break it down on the individual basis and say, okay, well, what does that mean? Largely, if you have a $300,000 assessed home, a 10-cent property tax is probably going to, it's going to run about 300 of additional dollars. And at least it makes it real. And I think that's one of the great things about local government is that, we don't really have deficit spending, and by and large, there is a sense of like, okay, in the long term, again, you have fund balance, you have one-time money and COVID money and all that, but really in the long term, our residents pay for the services that they consume. And so that is at least intellectually, I think, an interesting concept, because there is that relationship. If you want this level of service, you're probably going to need to have that level of taxation.
Yeah, Kevin, you kind of hit on another of our basic tensions, and Robbie just ended up there. In the end, we have to balance our budget, but it's not a choice. And if the budget doesn't balance, you can only do one of two things. You raise revenue, which means higher tax rates, or you reduce expenditures. And people will often tell us, well, you just need to spend less. But what they don't want to face is that spending less means reducing services and service levels. And almost nobody wants that. So what our county elected officials are faced with all the time is a choice between raising tax rates, which nobody wants, or cutting services, which nobody wants. I would not want to be a county elected official.
Yeah, it's not easy, right? And you know what you're walking into, but these times are certainly trying. And I also, it leads us to, maintaining what you're doing and trying to grow and trying to build infrastructure. And everybody loves infrastructure. We talk a lot about it, not just roads, bridges, transit, but also like the unsexy stuff like wastewater treatment facilities and the like, right? It's a lot more expensive to build and maintain these projects these days. So that's another tension, right? And it has to be something that you're thinking about and talking about, especially when we look at the state and we look at highway user revenues, which have been cut over the years. We're clawing some of that back, but it's nowhere near where we need to be. It's just an example of a cost that's been shifted to counties, and counties have no way to pay for it, right? There's no local gas tax. This is all coming out of property tax revenues. So they're asking to pay for infrastructure now, pay for the roads with property tax revenue, pay for the blueprint with property tax revenue, and everything else. So when the state makes a decision like that, it really amps up the pressure. And when we're dealing with all this other stuff on top of it, the state cutting funding for community colleges, the highway user that's still there, we had a shift in teacher pensions years ago, right? All of that stuff is, I think, bearing its head now. And we're seeing all of these pressures and then trying to find out how to maintain that. And on top of it, come up with the money to pay for the blueprint. So when it comes to infrastructure, when it comes to local roads and bridges, the state's transportation trust fund is in trouble. We know that. They've taken some actions to try and fix it, but really it's just a Band-Aid. That's also a long-term thought for you all, not only short-term, but it's also something you have to be thinking about in terms of, well, how much money is the state going to be able to contribute? And what do we have to start thinking about if the state just turns off the spigot to maintain what we already have?
Well, I think most of us, if we're talking about highway user revenue, most of the counties at this point have all pretty much just said, look, whatever we get is great, and we'll be able to use it, but it's really not a part of our long-term plan. And for those of us who were working at the time, I was working for TED, when highway user revenue was cut by 90%, within 1 month of the fiscal year back in August of 2010 or so. And it took a lot of adjustments, and you look at what we're getting now, Harford County before the cut, we were receiving about $15 million. It got down to as low as 1 or 2. Now it looks like it might be getting back up to around, 4 or 5, but like $4 or $5 million of highway user revenue. So Harford County has about 1,000 road miles, and with $5 million, on average, you can repave about 25 miles. That's just the repaving. That's not getting into bridges and snow plow removal. Snow removal. All of those things. That would be just repaving. So it really has become an expenditure that's just funded, now with just local tax dollars. And we hope that in the future we'll continue to get more money out of the highway user revenue. But you can also just look at the dynamics of what they're dealing with. They have a lot of expensive projects. All of the projects are much more expensive. A lot of projects that are going to cost a lot of money when you start talking about things like the Red Line and finishing up the Purple Line and some of these other projects, let alone some of the other transportation projects we have around the state, the tunnels and the like. And it doesn't seem as if there's going to be really a state solution, at least not a state revenue sharing solution. So,
yeah, I agree. I've been telling our commissioners for years, forget about getting highway user revenue back. Be glad to be wrong, but I can't imagine that they'll ever come up with enough money to do that again. And I think when people talk about state shared tax and taking care of the road systems, most people don't know that counties maintain more miles of roads than the state does. But we're having to struggle to figure out, how to do that. And, when you talk about the idea of reducing services as a way of balancing your budget, doing less road maintenance is a way to reduce expenditures. But how many people come to public hearings advocating for their road to be in worse shape than it is today?
Right. That's a small section of the peanut gallery, I have no doubt. But I guess, if we're looking for a silver lining in this political fight over local transportation and that sort of stuff, I would say there's a glimmer of hope that arose from the sort of dust up over transportation fighting just this past year. That, our listeners remember back around Thanksgiving, the governor said, we've got a big shortfall. Department of Transportation has a plan, but it's going to require austerity at every level. We're not going to be able to clean up the medians of highways, and we're going to have to cancel projects, and we're going to have to we're going to have to cut back on highway user revenue to locals and support for local transit, and like this whole list of cutbacks. And General Assembly took that really seriously. Had it must have been 2 or 3 hour hearing early in the session in the Appropriations Committee in the House. And honestly, that was the first time that a lot of those fiscal leaders got that reality check that you just mentioned. Like, Ted, you just mentioned, most people don't realize that the overwhelming share of the roads and bridges around the state are maintained by county and municipal government, not by the state. I mean, everything without a route number, that's local, that's maintained locally. People don't realize that. And in all candor, most delegates and senators don't even realize that. So it was honestly good as we got into the fight this year to find a wave of legislators who are part of the budgeting and fiscal process sort of learn about this and realize, wow, these cuts would be a really big deal on the ground back in Baltimore or back in my district or wherever. So we came out of this session with some new champions, mostly people who were not in the legislature in 2009 when this all fell apart. Like, politically speaking, that's generations ago. So having some new folks kind of catch religion that the locals need our help, and this is on the ground stuff that my constituents care about. We have actually more people on our side than we did a year ago, oddly enough.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, every year that goes by since that 90% cut, you run the risk that fewer and fewer people remember that. Fewer and fewer people know that counties, local governments maintain the lion's share of the roads in Maryland. So we were aggressive in defending against those cuts. And I agree with Michael. I think it opened up people's eyes. I think going into next session, there is some momentum talking about local transportation needs and kind of the situation we're in right now. So that is a good thing. But for you all, I know you live for right now, and it's challenging. So I guess we've gotten through a lot, and I want to just kind of wrap all this up with you and Ted, Robbie, with your closing thoughts and kind of what you want people to know from where you sit, just going through the budget. You've heard all the testimony, you've dealt with all of that, you've run the numbers. Coming through this budget cycle, your big takeaways, and you're both doom and gloom. We get it, you're budget folks. But I mean, how do you see the next few years playing out based off of what you've seen this year, and how worried are you? And what do we need to do to make some changes here? I mean, if you had to make the decisions, what can relieve some of this pressure locally, and how do we move forward?
Yeah, I think it comes back to that mismatch right now between revenue growth and expenditure growth, and you're seeing that all across the board. We just recently received an income tax distribution, this week, and it was the first good news in about a year on the income tax. After kind of having several distributions of being down, and we're dealing with a lot of volatility right now, where we don't know, where these revenues are going. But one thing that I feel relatively confident on is that they're not going to be able to keep up with the expectations of expenditures. Part of that driven by inflation, part of that just driven by an increase in levels of service or mandates or the like. And so that's where we ultimately have to find an ongoing solution to all of this, and you find a level of government that individuals are willing to pay for, that they can live with, and not necessarily trying to just shift money around to make things happen, but to take a more comprehensive approach.
Yeah, I am worried. I'm always worried, but I think the worries are bigger now. Robbie mentioned how much our revenue is growing versus how much expenditures are growing. And this is not about expenditures are growing because we're finding new ways of spending money. We're just talking about keep doing the things that we're already doing. And in Carroll, if our school system, from their point of view, is being very prudent in what they're asking for and only looking for a step in COLA for their employees, and then just the basic cost increases, electricity goes up, that increase on an annual basis is likely to be more than the increase we're seeing in our budget total. So if we use it all to keep them whole from their perspective, then that means there's nothing for anybody else. Clearly that can't work. What the answer is, I don't know. There is no easy path out of this. Because as I was saying a little bit earlier, the solutions, raising taxes or cutting services, are not palatable to very many people.
Right. So at the state and local level, this is going to be interesting to see how this plays out. And, there really are only two options on the table, right, Michael? It's either you raise revenue or you cut services. And that's really the situation at the state and local level right now.
I think that's really, to use the cliche term, that's our bottom line, right? That's there's only so many places you can squeeze the balloon. At some point, somebody dropped a nugget saying, it's difficult being an elected official in local government. I would append on to that. I think it's awfully difficult being the budget manager or the budget director for a local government and trying to provide advice and counsel and direction on these issues, because it's fraught. Like almost all these outcomes end up being disappointing to somebody. It ends up being the taxpayers will bear a heavier burden, and that has its own consequences for equity and fairness and so forth, or we do without services that we'd like to be able to provide and would provide some benefit if we had the wherewithal. None of these decisions that end up just on the outside of what you can accomplish are easy. There's nothing about this that's easy, and times like this that are challenging and tough to forecast just make it even harder. So Godspeed to you fellas.
Yeah. And I think what also is the biggest challenge is that almost everything we do at the local level is stuff that means considerable amount to lots of just regular, real people, and lots of them. There's not a whole lot within a local government spending budget that you would just say, maybe in the same sense of the federal government, they're like, well, who uses that program? It's like, well, the library, the parks, and even the stuff that's considered administration, which is relatively small, is still kind of necessary to make it all run. So you don't have some of that normal, kind of almost easy cuts. Everything has a strong built-in constituency, and they're popular.
Yeah, I love the people who just come and say, hey, just cut the fat. Like your government, there has to be tons of money to slash. And then they get to Ted, and Ted shows them the numbers, and it's black and white, right? There's nothing to hide. I agree with you, Robbie. Like the things that you're budgeting for, the things that counties do every day affect everyday people. There's not a lot of bloat. There's not a lot of fat to cut. The numbers are what they are. So challenging times for sure, but we're glad to have two folks like you in the driver's seat in your counties trying to make these decisions and provide the best information and try to make it all work. But I think we can leave it there for today. As always, if you enjoy the podcast, please go ahead and subscribe. That way, all these episodes will be sent directly to the device of your choice. You can also follow along on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and then, of course, the Conduit Street blog. We will throw in the links some coverage for Harford and Carroll County's budget. They've just gone through the cycle, so we'll put that there for you, too. But for Michael Sanderson, for Robbie Sandlass, and Ted Zaleski, this is Kevin Kinnally signing off. Big thanks to our producer, Chantel Malcolm Lim, for making all of this work. But until next week, we will talk to you soon. Have a great week.